Okay, today we're going to be learning a technique called completing the square. All right, and the first couple of problems we're going to look at today is we're going to solve by finding square roots. And here's what we got: 4x squared plus 10 equals 46. All right, so this is kind of a little bit similar to what we just did. Okay, you got a 4x squared, but you got a 10 and you got a 46, and neither one of them have an x after them. So if you start by subtracting 10 from each side, you get 4x squared equals 36. And hopefully by now you're starting to notice that the 4 is a perfect square, so is the x squared, and so is the 36. So you got a bunch of perfect squares you're dealing with here. The next step in this problem can be to just get the x squared by itself. So if you divide both sides by 4, then x squared equals 9. And now if you find the square root of each side here, then x is equal to the positive or negative square root of 9. So x equals positive or negative 3. And that is solving by finding square roots. All right, you simplified the equation. You got the x squared on one side by itself, and then you found the square root of 9. So let's say we get 3x squared minus 5 equals 25. All right, in this case, we're going to add 5 each side. So 3x squared equals 30. And then if you divide both sides by 3, then your x squared is equal to 10. And if you find the square root of each side, then your x is equal to the positive or negative square root of 10. And those are your two solutions. Obviously, it's a little simpler than factoring. 7x squared minus 10 equals 25. You can add 10 to each side. So your 7x squared would equal 35. You can divide each side by 7. So x squared would equal 5. And if you square root both sides, then x would be equal to the positive or negative square root of 5. All right, so any questions on finding square roots? All right, so next we're going to look at solving a perfect square trinomial. Solving a perfect square trinomial. All right, so here we go. We got an x squared plus 4x plus 4 is equal to 25. So in this case, the left side of this equation is what's called a perfect square trinomial. It means that the first term is a perfect square, and the last term is a perfect square. And since the middle term is the sum of 2 and 2, which are the factors of 4, it makes it a perfect square trinomial. All right, so what you can do here is you can factor this left-hand side. This left-hand side factors to x plus 2 squared. And that's still equal to 25. With me? Now, since this whole quantity is being squared, if you square root the entire left side and you square root the entire right side, the square root of x plus 2 squared is just x plus 2. And that's equal to the square root of 25, which is positive or negative 5. So now you can pull your two solutions out of here by writing two equations. The first equation would be that x plus 2 is equal to positive 5. The other equation is that x plus 2 is equal to the negative 5. And that's what that positive or negative 5 means, or the positive negative symbol in front of the 5. Is it the x plus 2 is equal to positive 5, or the x plus 2 is equal to negative 5. And then you can solve each equation. So if you subtract 2 from each side, then x is equal to 3. And if you subtract 2 here, then x is equal to negative 7. And those are your two values of x, or your two zeros for the parabola. And now we're going to try another one of those. Let's take a look at x squared minus 14x plus 49. And that's equal to 25. All right, and again, now on the left-hand side of this equal sign, your first term is an x squared, which is a perfect square, and your last term is a positive 49, which is also a perfect square. Now, the only difference in these last two problems are the sign of the middle term. And in this case, the sign of the middle term is negative. So this is another perfect square trinomial. All right, this first trinomial, this was x squared plus 4x plus 4. Perfect square, but a positive. Now we've got perfect square, and a negative in the middle. Right here is a negative. So watch how this factors. This factors now to x minus 7 squared. and that's equal to 25. So now your steps are the same as the first problem. If you find the square root of both sides, then the square root of x minus 7 squared is just x minus 7, and it's equal to positive or negative 5. So now you can write two equations, and the two equations would be that x minus 7 equals positive 5, or x minus 7 equals negative 5. You can add 7 here to both sides, and we get an x equal to 12. And then over here, you can add 7 to both sides again, and x is equal to negative 5, positive 2. All right, so there's your two values for x, or your two zeros for the parabola. That's where the parabola is going to hit the x-axis. It's going to hit it at 12 and 2. Let me show you. If you took x minus 7 squared, that's the same as x minus 7 times x minus 7, right? So what we're doing is we're factoring this trinomial, and we're getting this as the factor. Well, x minus 7 times x minus 7 is the same thing as x minus 7 squared, isn't it? Because it's something times itself. So if you did the distributive property here, you would have x times x is x squared. X times negative 7 is negative 7x. And then if you distribute this negative 7 times x is another negative 7x. And negative 7 times negative 7 is positive 49. And now when you combine your like terms in the middle, you get x squared minus 14x plus 49. So these two are equal to each other. If it's 13, then it's not going to be a 49 at the end. If the first term's a perfect square and the second term is a perfect square, what's in between them is going to be the right number. Otherwise, if it's not, we're going to learn next week how to solve these using the quadratic formula, which is really no fun. But if you can solve a quadratic by factoring, it's the fastest, simplest way to solve a quadratic. If you can't solve it by factoring, your next option is the quadratic formula. No fun at all. Very time consuming. Lots of chances to make a very small mistake with a sign, which throws off your whole answer. So for now, we're kind of dealing with perfect square trinomials and hoping that we can factor them. All right. Some other perfect square trinomials. You know, if you had an x squared as the first term and you had a positive 25 as the last term, in here, we could have plus 10x. Okay? Y'all see it? Perfect square and perfect square. And remember what the middle is? Isn't the middle the sum of the two factors? Wouldn't this be x plus 5 times x plus 5, which is written as x plus 5 squared? Y'all see it? If it was x squared minus 10x plus 25, then what are the factors? Good. Then it's x minus 5 squared. but you still got a perfect square and you've got a perfect square. And the next technique that we're going to learn is going to be based on y'all understanding this perfect square concept. If you had x squared plus 14x plus 49, all right, that's another perfect square trinomial. That factors to x plus 7 squared. X squared plus 20x plus 100. What does that factor to? Good. X plus 10 squared. All right. Perfect square, sum of the square root of the third term. All right. Even if you had like, oh, never mind. We'll see that later. You gaining a concept of perfect squares. Good, good, good. All right, so now we're going to learn, or you're going to learn a technique that's called completing the square. And that's when we can manipulate a trinomial into a perfect square so that we can solve using the same technique we just used right here. Okay? So let's get this written down. This is real important. You can form a perfect square trinomial. From x squared plus bx by adding b divided by 2 squared period. And let's do this. Let's not put a period there. Let's just say this. By adding b divided by 2 squared to both sides of the equation. So right now, we're just going to do this. We're going to say what value completes the square. And we got x squared minus 10x. What we're going to do here, what we're doing here is a technique called we're going to complete the square. We're going to take this expression. There's no equal sign yet. And we're going to determine the value that turns this into a perfect square trinomial. We're looking for this value right out here. What value completes the square? Well, the rule we just wrote said that by adding b divided by 2 squared. So look, here's your b, your negative 10. Got it? What's negative 10 divided by 2? Good, negative 5. And what's negative 5 squared? Positive 25. See it? It's the first technique in completing a square. You take half of what's in the middle, half of negative 10. You take negative 10, you divide it by 2, you square it, and that's what goes there. Half of the middle squared. Half of the middle squared. Let's see, I can't believe they don't give you any more practice for that. Finding square roots, solve each equation. All right. What if we had x squared plus, and then we had a 16x, and we needed to find out what value completes the square? What's going to go out here? All right. You take 16, you divide it by 2, and you square it. So what do we add out here? Positive. Good, 64. 16 divided by 2 is 8, squared is 64. So you just formed a perfect square trinomial. And you did that by a technique called completing a square. If you had x squared, let's go minus 12x. And you need a value to complete this square. What's going in the box out here to make this a perfect square trinomial? Negative 12 divided by 2, and you square it. Negative 12 divided by 2 is, good, we're going to put a positive 36 out here. And now while we're here, let's factor these. All right? Your factors, when you factor these, are whatever this is. This factored, x squared minus 10x plus 25. Factored, that's x minus 5 squared. This value, whatever was in here, is this value. They're the same. They're what you square to get the third number, and they're what you use as a factor. All right, this factor is 2x plus 8 squared, because 16 divided by 2 is 8, and the square root of 64 is 8. All right, this factors 2x minus 6 squared. Negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6. All right, and the square root of 36 is 6. But in this case, you needed a negative here in the middle. All right, so any questions on just completing a square? Oh, that's all right. Let's see. We're going to complete the square, complete the square, complete the square. All right, so here's what we're going to do now. We're going to use this technique. We are going to solve by completing the square. All right, so let's look at x squared minus 12x plus 7, and it's equal to 0. Now, if you're told to solve an equation by completing the square, that's a hint that this trinomial can't be factored. All right, we solved by factoring yesterday. But if you look at x squared minus 12x plus 7, The only factors of 7 are 1 and 7. And with a 1 and a 7, you can't get to a 12. With a 1 and a 7, you can get a 6 and you can get an 8. And that's it. All right. Now, this technique, completing the square, lets you still avoid the quadratic formula. So here's what we do first. We subtract this 7 from each side. We get x squared minus 12x. And we leave a space, a pretty decent sized space. And we write equals 0 minus 7 is -7. Now, you got to be careful here. You got an equal sign now. Got an equal sign now. Don't forget that you got an equal sign. Once you've got an equal sign, like up here the question was what value completes the square? And all we were doing was just completing the square. There was no equal sign in this problem. But now we're solving an equation by completing the square. So there's an equal sign in this problem. So you need to be a little bit more careful because you're going to combine some techniques. We're going to complete the square on this left side by taking half of b and squaring it. So what goes in here? What's half of b squared? Half of b squared is half of -12 is squared is good, +36. Now, since I wrote that +36 on one side of an equal sign, I got to write +36 on the other side of the equal sign. Huge concept. We completed the square on the left by adding 30 by adding 36. So adding 36 to the left, you got to add 36 to the right. Now we can factor the left side. The left side now is a perfect square trinomial, and it factors to x minus 6 squared. And that's equal to -7 plus 36. And -7 plus 36 is 29. And now, earlier in the lesson, we did a problem just like this. We found the square root of each side. The square root of x minus 6 squared is x minus 6. And it's equal to positive or negative radical 29. So now we write two equations. X minus 6 equals positive square root of 29. X minus 6 equals negative square root of 29. And if you were to solve both of these, you would add 6 to each side. So x would equal 6 plus square root of 29. And x would equal 6 minus the square root of 29. And actually, moving forward, you can take this. If you got x minus 6 equals positive or negative radical 29, and you want to add 6 to each side right here, x would be equal to 6 plus or negative, positive or negative, 6 plus or minus square root of 29. That and these are the same. This is how you will see it listed in your answer sheet, or as the answers to your problems today. Making any sense? I hope. Few steps, but I don't think they're real difficult steps. Let's try another one by completing the square. Let's try x squared minus 2x equals 5. Now, if they give you x squared minus 2x equals 5, leave some space in here. Because you got to add something to both sides. So we're going to complete the square here. We're going to take half of the middle term, and we're going to square it. We're going to add it to both sides. So half of -2 is -1. And -1 squared is +1. So if we add a +1 to the left, we add a +1 to the right. You got this negative sign in here. You got perfect square, and you just made a perfect square. So this factors to x minus 1 squared, and it's equal to 6. If you find the square root of both sides, then your x minus 1 is equal to positive or negative radical 6. If you add 1 to each side, your x is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of 6. Hopefully you understand that. Anybody have any questions on anything we talked about today? All right, your practice problems for today are on page 237. We're going to do 12 to 16, 28 to 40, and do the evens. Then check focus for homework. That will be under alerts. Under alerts. All right, anybody in the Zoom meeting have a question? There's no question from the Zoom meeting or in class.